In September of 1820, Keats sailed to Rome in hopes of recovering from his tuberculosis. It was thought at the time that a drier climate might help the lungs of the patient suffering from tuberculosis. Keats had no money really at this time. He gave most of his money away to his brother George, who was trying to make a go of it in Kentucky. So a lot of Keats's friends got together and raised money for him to sail to Italy, to Rome. And along with him came not a very close friend, but a friend named Joseph Severn, who was an artist, a visual artist, also a writer. So Keats sails in September of 1820. When he gets to the coast of Italy, he's put in quarantine for quite a while. It's a rather hellish time on a small, smelly, crowded ship. But finally he is released along with Severn into Rome. And the two find a small apartment on what is now called the Spanish Steps. You can go visit this apartment even now. It's the Keats Shelley house. You can go into the room where Keats himself breathed his last. In this small room, Keats spent the last months of his life in the horror that tuberculosis brought to those that it killed. During this time, he was feverish. He suffered from nausea, vomiting, suffered from diarrhea. He had a hard time keeping anything on his stomach. He would fall into fits of deep melancholy. He would become suicidal. He would become petulant. Sometimes Severn would bring him dinner and he would toss it back at Severn, or he would throw it out the window. This is not the Keats that we know from the great letters about selflessness and transcending ego. This is a sick man whose every second is agony and who is doing whatever he can to escape his pain. But there's a glorious moment right when Keats dies. Only hours before he dies, he can feel it coming. He's sweaty, he's emaciated, and in fact, right at this time, Severn sketches the poet. And we still have this sketch. You can find it online fairly easily. Just Google Severn sketch, Keats' death. And you'll see this touching portrait of a friend who has cared for someone for months now in this very tiny room. And there's a look of utter weariness on the face of Keats. I wouldn't call it peace so much as weariness. You can see his hair matted to his forehead. He is moribund. He doesn't have much longer to live. And this is what he says to Severn right around this time. In his last hours, he looked up at Severn and he says, "Severn, lift me up. I am dying. I shall die easy. Don't be frightened. Be firm. And thank God it has come." A moment where suddenly the dying man no longer looks to his own pain, but instead looks to the suffering of his friend, being empathetically aware what Severn himself has gone through, more concerned about how this might affect Severn. Oh my gosh, what's it like to see your friend die? More concerned about how this death might affect Severn than himself. So we see here in Keats's final moment a flowering of that virtue that he discussed so often in his letters, most notably in the famous letter, Negative Capability. In this famous letter of 1818, December of 1818, written to his brothers, he says the following. He says, "I was thinking about what makes for a man of achievement, what makes a great poet, what makes a great person in any endeavor." And he thinks, well, Shakespeare possessed this. And what is it? Negative capability. That is, when man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. Coleridge, for instance, would let go by a fine isolated verisimilitude caught from the penetralium of mystery, from being incapable of remaining content with half knowledge. So we've discussed this before, the idea that the greatest poets do not express their ego. They are not Wordsworthian. They are not consumed by the egotistical sublime. Instead, they're like Shakespeare. They become what they write. So when you read a Shakespeare play, you don't find William Shakespeare in the play. You find the poet distributed throughout the characters he has created. So Shakespeare becomes Iago. He becomes Imogen. He becomes Lear. He becomes Macbeth. He becomes Rosalind. So the egolessness, the transcendence of the I is what makes for poetic greatness. This is why Keats says that the great poet is like a chameleon. He is not anything properly. He becomes what he writes about. At another place, he says that the poet has no ego at all. In a great poem, you shouldn't see the poet at all. So this appears over and over again in Keats's letters, this idea. But also we see it very much in his poems, which are less about John Keats, but are more about what he's paying attention to. So we read Ode to a Nightingale, and we read Ode on a Grecian Urn, and we read To Autumn. And in each of these poems, it's hard to find a historical poet in contrast to how it's quite easy to find a historical poet in a Wordsworth ode like Tintern Abbey or the Intimations ode. So selflessness, generosity, empathy, the going out of self into other. These are not only aesthetic values for Keats, but also they are what we might call ethical ones as well. The way to treat others well is to try to see the world as they see it. And even on your deathbed, when you would think you would be most selfish and petulant, as indeed Keats was for much of his time in Rome, you can go out of that and imagine what's it like to see a friend die. And that's what Keats does, really in probably one of his last breaths.